I have, in my remarks here, good afternoon, because I'm in New York and it's 3 p.m. here. But, as we were just saying, this is a global council, so I should say good morning and good evening. And, some of you might be enjoying that 5 p.m. cocktail and others might be enjoying the first coffee or tea of the day. Wherever you are, welcome, or maybe you're starting your day off with a cocktail. We are entering the third calendar year of this pandemic, so you do what you got to do. So just all that to say, welcome, to the first Global Council event and briefing of 2022. I'd like to welcome my fellow board members who are on the call and our Global Council members. It's a joy to see your smiling faces, especially in light of, some of the challenges that Omicron is creating in our daily lives. It's just wonderful to come together virtually and see you all. We have an excellent program for you today. Joining us is none other than IFAW's president and CEO, as we like to call him, our content creator in chief, and just all around exceptional human being and friend, Azzedine Downes. So welcome, Azzedine. You're welcome. We are just a few weeks into this new year. And I know that for many of us, the start of a new year brings about, maybe some deep personal reflection. We're looking back on ways to improve. We're setting resolutions and goals for the future. And IFAW is no different. We as an organization, we have a lot to reflect on, and we're setting goals and strategies of our own to ensure that everything that we do in 2022 and beyond is in the service of our charitable purpose of ensuring that animals and people thrive together in the place that they call home. And so who better to engage with in a discussion and that forward-looking conversation than with our fearless leader, Azzedine, who really is just a true visionary and just has a unique and pragmatism, to turn bold vision into reality. So very excited to start that conversation today. Before we get started, I did want to check off a few housekeeping items that I think 3 years into the Zoom world, we should all be pretty familiar with, but I'll go through them anyway. Please make sure that your microphones are muted as we engage in the fireside chat portion of the briefing. Of course, we will be opening it up for questions. Please feel free to type questions in the chat as we go. I will certainly be monitoring the chat box and asking those questions live, but of course, this is meant to be participatory, so we will be opening it up for questions live. So do feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question towards the end, and we'll do our best to get. I hope that we're in for a pretty robust conversation, because it's not very often that we have access to Azzedine as the CEO and to his well of knowledge and vision. So please prepare your questions on strategy and vision and perspectives for Azzedine so that he can answer them today. So anything else, Heather, that I'm missing? No, I think just maybe, since this is really all about connectivity, this global council was really established for all of us to network with each other and connect with one another. That's certainly made a lot easier if we can all see each other. So it would be great if you could turn your videos on, even if you're not actively participating in the conversation. It would be great to see your beautiful faces. All right, so let's kick it off and get started. So Azzedine, we're, 2 weeks into 2022, which is crazy. We made it. I think we have so much to celebrate as an organization, and yet, so much work still lies ahead and needs to be done. But before we get into kind of what's in store for 2022, I'd love it if you could take us back through 2021 and describe some of the challenges, wins, obstacles, and just general reflections that you have in your leadership position, and just from an institutional perspective.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ali, and thanks everyone for joining. Happy New Year. I should say, because I talk a little bit about, you know, 2021, we thought the pandemic would be over, and we certainly thought it would be over by 2022, and here we are still. I, at the very beginning, and some of you have told you this before, but focused on three things when the pandemic broke, and that was to keep everyone at IFAW safe, to keep everyone employed, because that was a big question, whether or not we would be able to survive financially. There was a lot of doom and gloom. And then thirdly, and probably most importantly, was to focus on the frontline workers so that we would not abandon them no matter what happened that first year with rescue operations in particular. So when I talk about frontline workers, for us, that means that the people who rescue and the rangers who are out there anti-poaching. So I'm happy to say that we survived, I think, with everyone pretty much healthy. Unfortunately, and I have a Ricola in my mouth now, and so if I sound a little hoarse, it's because I just got COVID after all of the year, 2 years of avoiding. It finally got us with this Omicron, but not too bad. But if I sound hoarse, that's why. And normally I wouldn't have a lozenge in my mouth or drinking tea, but I want to make sure I can keep talking. That said, 2021 was pretty amazing, I would say, overall, because we were able to continue to work. Travel did open up, and travel for us is critically important when we talk about more on the conservation side and the policy side, because you have, one thing that we have learned is that people are social, and you can do as many of the Zoom calls as possible. Some really good news, I think, in the last year, that with training, for example, we were able to do a lot more than we were previously able to do, because more people could participate in the trainings for rangers and some of the wildlife crime issues of working with customs officials, for example. So a lot more people could actually participate. There's the Zoom fatigue, but I was able to travel this year, which I wasn't able to do at all the previous year. So, we can talk about it as we go through the session today. But I was able to get out to Dubai, where we're based in the Middle East. And we have some exciting things coming up in the month of March on women in conservation, and a concept that I'm working on to change the face of conservation, so that some incredible women who are actually working get on the stage and have a more powerful voice. So we talk about that. I was also in Kenya, and I was there twice, just very recently, where I brought the chiefs from Malawi and from Zimbabwe. And I'm really excited about that, and we'll talk more about that and take as many questions as you have about something that we're going to launch in the month of March. I was scheduled to be in Tanzania, where we're going to be expanding. We're working on registering there as an organization. And then working in Nyeri National Park, which there was previously a lot of trophy hunting taking place there, which will no longer take place. So that I'm hoping we'll be able to launch in March or April of this year. And then I was in Malawi and Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe, there's always a lot of questions, so I won't say too much about that, but try to answer questions that you have. Anytime you're working in Southern Africa, you get a lot of questions about, CITES and the sale of ivory and the sale of rhino horn. And they have a very, very different view of rescue and the importance of individual animals. So it's not always a pleasant, it's not always a pleasant trip, but yeah, 2021, I would say that the most amazing thing is that we were able to continue to save lives of individual animals and rescue. And that's what we were most worried about, I think, because of the pandemic, that would rangers and would rescuers be able to, one, stay healthy, and two, have the funding and the ability to get out and save lives. But when you look at some of the materials, and I hope you can always get those. Heather will send things out to all of the global members of the number of animals that we've rescued, from koalas to elephants to all of the animals that suffered through the impacts of climate change and disasters. So it was an amazing year. It was a busy year, but I would leave you with the thought that there's a pent-up energy. There's a pent-up energy to get moving and engage with people who just don't take decisions unless you have personal relationships with them. And if you don't have those relationships and you can't travel, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Azzedine. I think that sets us up rather nicely to start that conversation about the year ahead. I certainly feel some pent up energy to execute on some of the goals and strategies that we've been discussing, even since the start of the pandemic back in 2020. So as we look at the year ahead, it would be great to hear from you, what you and senior leadership have planned, what's on your plate, and really what are you most excited about? And also, what brings you hope, for the future?
Yeah, well, that last question is probably one we could talk about for months, years, but the focus for the organization for the next year, but really beyond that, we just began the second institutional strategic plan that we've put in place. And the major undertaking is an initiative that we call Room to Roam. And this is really going to be the focus of the organization widely, but also senior leadership. And I just had a meeting this morning with some of our colleagues in Africa to lay out what Room to Roam really means in all of its aspects. And basically, I think everyone knows that we focus on two pillars, and the first pillar is rescue, and the second is conservation. And that's what makes IFAW unique, is that we put the rescue of individual animals together with the conservation. And to boil it all down, it means that it doesn't help to rescue an animal if they have nowhere to live. They have nowhere to go back to the wild. And so that's why we focus on protected areas and the restoration of protected areas. So Room to Roam, in a nutshell, is looking in Africa. It's focused in Africa, all the way from Kenya through Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia to Zimbabwe. Focused on elephants, because elephants, if elephants are safe, other wildlife is safe. And to protect areas, one, that are not protected now, two, to restore areas that are protected, but are no longer critical habitat for elephants and other wildlife for a variety of reasons. And there's constant pressure across Africa on critical habitat, and it could be investments from mining or transportation or agriculture or human growth, and development, all of those things. But the concept is to create or to restore the corridors that elephants have historically used, so that they can move across a greater landscape. And the focus won't be just simply on national parks. It's to start there. And if you sort of look at it as concentric circles inside a park, some of them are paper parks, meaning they're protected on paper in a plan, but there's really no one actually there, and wildlife is not protected. So it's not just about the national parks, but if you start inside the national parks, increase protection. So we wipe out poaching, and we have a lot of wildlife crime work that we do. But then the next concentric circle is the communities. And this is why I brought the chiefs from Malawi and Zimbabwe to see the work that we do in Kenya with our Maasai partners. They're probably 5 to 10 years ahead of many of the other countries in Southern Africa, because the communities themselves have put in place land trusts, protected areas. There's the legal framework to protect that land. There's ownership issues. There's a lot of issues of indigenous people and rights and land use rights. And then there's all sorts of investments that are happening. And this is why I am very, very positive about the discussions about climate change are always so pessimistic and negative. But one of the things that I see happening is that the private sector is being forced to look at how they invest. And if they're not investing in ways that mitigate climate change, their investments won't be insured. And so that got their attention. How that translates for us is that there's an increased view that investing in nature is something that we must do to, one, stop the pandemic, right? That's sort of the upside of all of the discussions going around about, how did the pandemic begin, and zoonotic diseases and things like that. But secondly, the focus of conservation and involving communities has always been just around ecotourism, and in some places trophy hunting, and lots of arguments about the sale of ivory and things like that. But the shift that leaves me optimistic is that there is increased focus and investment possibilities to mitigate for climate change, and carbon sequestration is where we're involved. We're not involved in reducing emissions per se as a mission of our organization, but keeping natural space viable for wildlife is good for the wildlife, and it's good for the communities, and ultimately it's good for the planet. So it's a big, big vision. It has a lot of moving parts, but that's what I'm going to be focusing on, for the foreseeable future, because it's a massive undertaking.
Oh, it's a huge undertaking. And I think I want to draw a little bit more on your recent trip and the experiences that you had engaging with the local communities there, because
Yeah.
I like to stress, in every conversation that I have about IFAW and our approach, that we really do take a bottom-up approach. All of our strategies and our programs are informed by, our partners on the ground and the very valuable relationships that we've worked really hard to build on the ground. So I'd really like for you to speak a little bit more deeply about your recent trips, and maybe just touch on like 1 to 3 points and takeaways that really opened your eyes as to what we should really be focusing on in terms of messaging and in terms of community and relationship building at that level, to realize these bigger, broader campaigns like Room to Roam that we talk so much about.
Yeah, so I think many Global Council members know that we've been in Kenya for a long time, and we have a long-standing relationship with the Maasai community working outside of Amboseli. The reason why that work there is so critical, and how it relates to what you're asking about, Alejandra, is that that's a very small area. Right. So wildlife spends 80 to 90% of their time outside of a national park. So this notion that wildlife just exists inside a national park and you protect a national park is kind of an outdated view of the reality. On a political level, there's been a lot of changes in how land is managed, who owns land ownership, tenure. if you look at the example of Kenya with the Maasai, as I mentioned earlier, we worked with them to help put in a plan for land use plan, and 30% of the land that they own is set aside for conservation, and that's where we focus our investments. So we leased that land, attracting other investments at the same time. All of that said, it took 5 years at least to make sure that the legal frameworks were in place. Who actually owned the land? It was a group ranch, and then we began with I think 1,900 individual landowners who wanted to have revenue directly sent to them from the lease. Well, they didn't have bank accounts. Many of them are illiterate. And so there were all sorts of things that we had to think about in terms of how are we going to ensure that communities actually receive revenue in ways that they previously had not. It's been a great success and a great partnership in Kenya. And so my thought was, when I was in Malawi, we're working in Kasungu National Park, I also met with the chief, the head chief, who leads the community outside of the national park. And I thought, well, it would be just a great idea to bring him to Kenya so that he could ask himself, the Maasai leadership, why they did what they did and why they decided to work with IFAW and why they decided to protect elephants and how does it actually help them. The same thing in Zimbabwe, which politically has a very aggressive view of wildlife sustainability. It's seen as an agricultural product. And that's why you get into all of these issues about trophy hunting and sustainable use and things like that. So I thought, okay, well, it's a risk. But I always believe in telling the truth, whether or not it immediately affects IFAW in a positive way, and I believe in that, and I think that's how you build up trust. So I knew that there would be questions from Zimbabwe, the chief from Zimbabwe in particular, about why don't you allow hunting in Kenya, and why do you work with IFAW, who opposed the sale of ivory and rhino horn, all of those things that happened at CITES. So they both agreed to come. And the first thing that I'd say, and why this is critical and why it's going to make a difference, is that the amount of land that is actually overseen, managed, or owned, and there are very different views of what that means. It's not like in many countries where you say, well, who owns the land, and it's very clear and there's a title and all of these things. In some of the places where we work, that concept of individual ownership of land is something that's emerging. And there's a lot of opposition to it. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. In Kenya, just very briefly, a number of the people not working with us sold their parcel of land, went off to Nairobi, enjoyed the revenue for a few months, came back and said, well, I'm back. And the person who bought their land said, well, you no longer own the land. They couldn't accept that. And it wasn't a concept of, well, what do you mean? I mean, this is Maasai land, so it's mine. So there's all sorts of cultural things that we have to deal with. But in short, this is what happened. The chiefs came, we landed at Amboseli National Park, and before we even got to the lodge where we were staying for meetings, there were herds of elephants walking by. There was a pride of 20 lions with 7 cubs, 2 massive male lions roaring. Kilimanjaro came out with a snowstorm. I mean, it was an absolutely idyllic scene. And they could not believe it. And this is the message that they took away, and we can talk about it as we go through questions and things, is that their first impression was, this can't be real. Now these are tribal chiefs saying this. This can't be real. Where are the guns? Where are the fences? How can people live like this? This is not possible. And they were frightened. They were frightened. They kept asking me, are they going to attack? And I kept saying, well, but who? And they said, the elephants. The elephants are getting ready to attack. And I said, no, if you follow me on Facebook, you see sometimes I talk about this, is that the elephants are very aggressive in Southern Africa, where they're not aggressive in places like Amboseli because they haven't been hunted, and they're sentient beings and very sensitive. So they were actually overwhelmed. The chief from Malawi said to his Maasai brothers and sisters, I don't think you understand what this place is. This must be Eden. This must be the Garden of Eden. And he kept talking about Adam in the Bible being given the task of naming the animals. And he said, this must be Eden. This must be where it took place. And the Maasai, I think, were also kind of taken aback, saying, but wait a minute, isn't your land, isn't your space in Africa like this also? And so it was an incredible exchange. And how the meeting or the week that we spent together ended was they put out a statement in support of an idea that I put forward, thinking, we can't just work with governments. We've always worked with communities, but where is their voice and who takes the decisions to protect the land? And if you're looking at the amount of time that wildlife spends outside of national parks, which is government managed, they're in community lands. And so I put forward a concept to form a conservation network of African leaders. And we're going to get together again in March of this year. The thing that I learned, which again, comes from listening and being patient, is that the chief from Malawi, who I originally thought just oversaw the land outside of Kasungu National Park, turns out to be the chief of the Chua people, all the way from Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique, and a population of over 3 million people. So an incredibly influential person, who also told me that in March we're going to bring 2 other chiefs from Zambia who come from a matriarchal society, and the women chiefs will be sort of the founding partners in this new network that we're going to form, and that will give communities a voice from their leadership that could be a counterbalance to some of the government policies that are in place and with which we don't agree.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more and unpack that a little bit more, because I think, we've had a lot of conversations about disrupting, traditional models of conservation and how we do that. And, we're speaking pretty broadly about the members of those communities, but let's speak a little bit more specifically about who we really need to see included in these new disruptive models of conservation. I think that since 2020, there's been really important dialogue about how we can't realize a new vision for conservation without gender and racial inclusivity. And Mira asks a really great question in the chat that I wonder if Azzedine, maybe you can elaborate on, which is just talk a little bit more about this initiative for women and what we're seeing in terms of women taking these leadership positions. Mira, please feel free. I've asked your question as it's written in the chat, but please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to elaborate on that question and on the second question that you've written here in the chat as well.
Just very briefly, and I'd really love to hear Azzedine's thoughts on this. In the African countries where we've worked, and it has varied from country to country, and certainly places like Kenya, there's a much more historically rooted model, for the community control and involvement in conservation. And in Namibia, it's just constitutionally mandated in certain ways, but in Zambia, it's pretty nascent. And also in Zambia, as well as in North Kenya, certain tribal attitudes and, just existing long-standing cultural patterns
Yeah.
make it difficult for women to choose alternative roles or to have access,
Yeah.
to other choices. So it's a process. So I'm just curious, what your thought is about, obviously you're going to lean on your partners on the ground, but, just thoughts about what that might be.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of examples, to your point, in Kenya, and the chiefs saw this too, which they were shocked by, that if you look at the Maasai, I think the first time that I met Mama Esther, who's a chair of a cooperative now that we set up, and culturally it was interesting to try to absorb what was being said, but the chairman at the time said, "Oh, I have good news for the meeting." And you sit under the tree, and that's not a figure of speech. You literally sit under the tree for days, and everyone gets there to say. Said women are now allowed to speak. And I said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And then he moved on, and I said, "Well, but here's Mama Esther. So why can't she speak?" And he said, "Oh yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point." So she stood up, and her first thing that she ever said to me was, "My name is Mama Esther. I love children. I love elephants. Thank you," and sat down. And that was it. 6 years later, she meets the chiefs. We went out to Steti village, which is in Ogugului Group Ranch outside of Amboseli. For the first time, where we've invested in women to do things that they've never done before in that particular cultural context, was Team Lioness. And so the first Maasai Rangers, which there was a lot of opposition. And if you sit down with them, and that's something we have to talk about there, is capturing these things on film, is what kind of opposition they had from their fathers, their brothers, the men, but also the other women, which I wasn't expecting. I handed over the first driver's license that a Maasai woman has ever had, and she's one of the Team Lioness members. It's such common sense, but in a cultural context, you're thinking, well, how are we going to achieve this? She couldn't respond to a poaching incident because there were vehicles available, but she couldn't drive. She didn't know how to drive. First Maasai woman to be able to get into a vehicle and be involved in an anti-poaching operation. When we went out to the village, the other cultural aspect of the Maasai, of course, is that their wealth and their prestige is based on how many cattle they have, and only the men have cattle. The women don't have the cattle. But because of the changes, the women's cooperative, were doing things that we buy and some of the beading work and things like that. But they used their funds to buy 6 bulls. First time Maasai women have ever owned cattle. And what I thought, we don't get involved in animal husbandry and things like that with farming, but we're always trying to convince the men to have fewer heads of cattle because it's better for them, it's better for the cattle, it's better for the landscape, it's better for the environment. So what do the women do? They just bought 6 bulls that they're going to keep for 6 months and then sell and triple their revenue that goes back to the women's cooperative. And I asked them, I said, well, what is it that you're doing with the money? And they showed me these solar powered lights that they now have inside their houses. For the first time they've ever had light inside their home. And the thing that they were most proud of was that for the first time, their children were able to do their homework at home at night. And I'm thinking to myself, if you ask me to make the link directly to how many animals they saved in that moment, I know that in future, you're investing in generations. And so that's a unbelievable shift. And I was curious to see how the two chiefs would react to meeting these women. And two things that happened, and this is where I think for Zambia it will be very interesting, and I haven't met these women yet, but that the Chua people, it's a matriarchal society who are chiefs from Zambia. So, I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope to meet them in March. The chief from Malawi was so impressed by what he saw, and he's a very enthusiastic fellow, and maybe we can put together an event someday where you meet him, because he's an incredible person to chat with. But he was so excited, he gave me the telephone number of the president of Malawi, and he said, well, why don't you just give him a ring? And I said, well, let's think a little bit more about the strategy, of what it is that we need. But he was on the phone with the president every single day that we were there. He told them all about the women. He told them all about the things that they were doing. And he focused on getting all of the documents that he could from the Maasai and from the women, talking to them about what is it that they were doing with the money, how did they attract it. There were, we have other donors, I don't know if they're on today, but, investing in education for women, sending women back to vocational education, so that they're actually, entrepreneurs, and that they're creating real revenue beyond some of the traditional things. And this is what I'm really trying to get at, is that there's the underpinnings of who controls, and it is about control. There's no question about it. Outside of those national parks, there is tribal, traditional, indigenous leadership that has been silent in conservation, and many of the women have a voice that they want to be heard, and saying, listen, we're 50% of the population. And honestly, in most instances, of course, everything, country to country is different, but in most instances, it's the women who are interacting more with wildlife and roaming through the habitat, because they're out there doing all sorts of things during the day. So from a wildlife crime perspective, it's the women who are more willing, it seems, to share information about who belongs in that landscape and who does not belong in that landscape. And you want to keep everyone safe too, because wildlife crime is a dangerous endeavor. But the chiefs left with thinking, this is transformational. This is transformational, that there are women who are leading on conservation. And it's very personal, asking, why would you protect an elephant? And the women, and we had to do a lot through translation, because I don't speak Ma, but saying that, listen, an elephant is a mother. An elephant is led by a mother, by females, and we want to be like elephants. So, fundamentally, it was a shift there that I thought, how can we find a platform that makes sense, and that is not tokenism either? Because I'm always concerned about, while we could bring people to a meeting, traditional dances and music and things like that, but I'm always concerned that there's a level of tokenism, so letting the women speak for themselves in a platform that doesn't exist now is really what I'm after.
Yeah, well, I think it's tokenism if it does nothing to really advance the conversation or to really disrupt. But I think that what we're seeing is that the inclusion here and the centering of these female leaders is really driving these efforts forward in a really, really meaningful way. And we should continue to do so and focus on that. And I'm personally really excited to meet some of these women in our upcoming board trip to Kenya, which hopefully doesn't get canceled by another
Yeah.
variant. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much, Azzedine. I think that's incredibly enlightening, and you know, again, just putting that in the context of our many priorities for 2022. So I think more to come and more updates on that. I received a question from Henry in the chat. Henry, I'm very happy to read it out to Azzedine, but please, if you'd like to unmute and ask the question yourself, please do.
Go ahead.
All right, so Henry writes, what is the fraction of poaching, trophy hunting, and human wildlife conflict which threaten the wildlife? Also, it seems like the room to roam simulates highways for the elephants between Eastern and Southern Africa. Surely the elephants would prefer a concentric circle model, which may or may not be technically possible due to the orders of magnitude greater geography. So I think Henry's looking for you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, you know, we talk about corridors, but you're right, Henry, they're not really highways. If you think about from a management and a strategic point of view, it's critical habitats that may or may not be connected now. And they're disrupted, those corridors or critical landscapes are disrupted in a variety of ways. And to the first part of your question is, in some cases, it's poaching. There's poaching. Now, I think overall, there's good news about poaching, and it's way down from where it was. So that's the good news. The reason it's down is that there, you know, IFAW and other organizations as well have really put a lot of effort into disrupting the poaching. But the networks are still there, you know, and you and I have talked about this, Henry, but on disruption, why we talk about disrupt training, and that's why we call it that, is and things like Tent Boma, which we launched in Kenya. The idea was to disrupt the criminal networks that are involved in wildlife crime. And if, in a nutshell, don't think about it in the context of a product. Early days, there was a lot of focus on, well, it's anti-poaching for ivory, or it's anti-poaching for rhino horn. But what we've learned is that it's not really about the product, it's the network, it's the criminal network, because they don't care. They're not elephant criminals, they're just criminals. And so poaching may be down, but something else is up, you know, drugs, cigarettes, charcoal. There's also, you know, the human trafficking is up in some places. So restoration of protected areas and protecting areas outside of national parks where there isn't, by and large, there isn't teams like Team Lioness that we have in Kenya. So that disrupts that corridor, if you will, or critical habitat. The other thing, of course, is transportation, roads, mining, agricultural investment. And this is why, you know, we talk about policy initiatives, room to roam, not just in Africa, but, you know, in our European offices, to focus on all of the investment from the EU in particular, which is not, the people with whom I've met, I'll just say diplomatically that they're not aware of wildlife conservation issues, and yet they're talking about infrastructure, they're talking about agriculture, they're talking about education, gender issues, and they're not thinking these are the people that live with wildlife. The other thing that, as part of room to roam, and it is a big, this is why it's far beyond what IFAW alone can do. If you look at the banks like Africa Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, the Africa Union, the EU, USAID, all of those investments are stovepiped. You know, and when you talk to people and say, well, why are you talking to me? I work in agriculture. And I said, well, yeah, it's great. You're planting desserts for the elephants, and they will just come in. And so your 20 million euros is going down the tubes because you never thought about where you're planting. You never thought about where those roads are. The other part of what I want to focus on is, I think everyone knows we have a big office in China. We've made incredible strides in reducing consumerism of wildlife products, putting those policies in place. But the reality is that there's massive Chinese investment in Africa. If you look at Wangi National Park, for example, there's an open pit coal mine right outside of the national park. And so we're working on producing a lot of what we're doing in Chinese language and reaching out to all of the embassies, Chinese embassies and others. I mean, the Saudis are also making huge investment in agriculture in Africa just for food security. So food security is another issue. The thing I'll leave you with there is on climate change. It is going to disrupt sort of traditional approaches, because if you're thinking, you take Southern Africa, for example, and climate change, and the West gets drier and the East gets wetter, the elephants and other wildlife will move. They'll move out of traditional areas now into areas that are managed or owned, again, by people. And so that's really why we focus on people, animals and people thriving together. And this notion that conservation is about one protected area that's already in place, it's no longer a valid argument. And that's why it's critical that we're going to need support from so many different ways to ensure before it's too late. And that's the point, Henry, is that before it's too late, it's not just a corridor in a highway that you can build and you call it a day. It's like an amoeba, I mean, there's constant pressures on habitat. And that habitat is not static. And that's because of climate change. It's not static, and we're already seeing that. And politically, as we've seen in other parts of the world, massive migration of people. And that's happening in a lot of the work we do with other species, including whales, northern right whales moving further north because of warming oceans. So, everywhere you look, I would say that protected areas are not static any longer, if they ever were.
So is it true then that criminal elements continue to be the biggest threat to wildlife vis-a-vis, say, human-wildlife conflict? And is it also true that when we get to the point where human-wildlife conflict is the main source of problems, that we are winning?
I think, on the last point, I'd say we're winning because one of the things that
because it's easier to deal with tribal people than it is with criminals.
Yeah, no, that's true, and you can demonstrate it. The takeaway for Malawi and Zimbabwe was something that they didn't believe previously, that it is possible to live with wildlife. And they became great ambassadors of saying, yeah, that's why you talk about animals and people thriving together. Now we can see it. I would say, criminality is always going to be a major issue, always. And it's not something that, I was just talking to the staff myself when we were in Dubai, because that's why we set up in Dubai, was to disrupt the transit area. So we focused on three things: where the animals live, the transit areas, which was largely through the Middle East, and then going to Asia and China. You can't ever believe that you're finished, that those networks, and I just learned very recently that a lot of the criminal network sending products from Africa through Middle East, which is where we were, to China, we've been so successful in disrupting that. It's now going the other direction and going to South Africa, to South America, and then to Asia. So it's going the other way. So, we're thinking about, well, what networks do we have in place to help disrupt there? But the other thing is just the human pressure of development.
What is the bad character country in South America?
Well, the
Brazil, Argentina.
Colombia.
Colombia.
Yeah, Colombia.
Ah,
Yeah. You know, if you did an overlay of criminality with drugs, it's the same. It's the same.
ah, ah. Okay.
Elizabeth Phillips had a question. Elizabeth, did you want to unmute and ask Azzedine directly?
Yes. Hello. I'm in Australia and hello, and support the Junior Ranger program in Zimbabwe. And I'm just wondering whether there were plans to expand that, or other programs which educate more school children and the future generation in conservation and the importance of protecting and caring for the animals, so that it's, you know, there's that multi-generational discussions within communities.
Yeah. So Zimbabwe is a major focus for us. The focal point is Wangi National Park. And I think you probably know about the elephant nursery that we support in Harare. And then the elephants move when they're ready up to Panda Masui, and that's where Victoria Falls is, just sort of geographically, so you kind of know. And that's where Wangi National Park is. And so we've already connected the rescue and the conservation part of our approach in that particular area. And the strategy is to sort of a domino effect of taking over through our partnerships the land that's actually owned in some cases by communities, and in other cases I've just learned by the president of Zimbabwe and the vice president of Zimbabwe. And all of those places previously allowed or encouraged trophy hunting. And so, you know, obviously we never support trophy hunting. And as we take over leases or fund the leases, you know, part and parcel of the agreements is that no trophy hunting takes place in those areas. And so we've had very, very good progress in this past year of 2 major pieces of land being converted into protected areas. And that gets to your point about who is going to protect that area, and junior rangers. And I'm always concerned too about keeping people safe, to honestly, because sometimes people, you know, and younger people, and I think of myself still young, but very enthusiastic, and sometimes they can get themselves into trouble. So I'm always concerned about keeping people safe too. But you know, the thing about investing, and I'm glad you're asking me this, because sometimes people will ask me, well, you know, IFAW, why do you work with people? Why would you invest in education of young people? Or why would you have your, you know, animal action awards and art contests and things that reach out to young people in many different ways? And the reason why we do it is because it is a long-term vision. It's a long-term vision of investing in people who do associate their life changing because they worked with IFAW. And I have a video that I actually took of a young man on this last trip, and it brought everyone to tears. This was a young boy that we invested in, and again, it began in a very sort of simplistic way of, why do you love animals? But this young man has now gone to university. He had the scholarship. He was a good student. He has a senior position in the Ministry of Health, and not only gone back to where he lives to provide medical services to the people who help us protect wildlife. He's also sent his 2 younger brothers to university. He's sending his sister to university. And he actually adopted a young girl that they're funding. And so, you know, in the course of 10 years, that investment is multiplying fivefold, all of whom say that they know they would not have been able to change their life if they hadn't helped us protect elephants. So that to me, it's a message I never leave behind. I never leave behind, because it moves leadership to tears, literally. These men, one of whom was so taken by some of the stories of the women that we're providing scholarships to, that they got up and left, and they said they never understood that people's lives were so difficult. And they're looking at IFAW thinking, how is it possible that you're protecting wildlife, but you're changing people's lives? It's because we're investing in a movement, not at a project level.
Yeah, I think you said it, you articulated it perfectly. I think youth has the power to move individuals to tears, but also to action. I think that so much of what's driving conversations around conservation is youth-led, women-led. And so continuing to center those individuals and stakeholders is just absolutely critical. And I thank you, Azzedine, for recognizing that and for prioritizing that. So I'd just like to note that we have about 2 minutes left. Yeah, time goes by fast on these global council briefings. I think there's just so much to talk about and so much to articulate about IFAW and about the great work that we do globally. I'm gonna just check in and see if anyone else has another question, even if we do run a couple minutes over, just because I do want folks to get that access. So anybody, any questions? Mira? Yeah,
just very quickly.
Okay,
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. The parameters or the future for Room to Roam, does that exist? And I'm doing catch up here, so you may all know the answer to this, but how elastic is its boundary profile? Will it potentially intersect possibly with other corridors, or what's the idea ultimately?
Yeah. I mean, the good news and the frightening news is that it's already attracting attention from other places and other countries. Uganda, we founded really the African Elephant Coalition a number of years ago, 22 countries in West Africa, including countries that have forest elephants. And so there's lots of requests to expand. I think probably the most challenging, honestly, is going to be with Botswana, who would like to discuss, because when you get to Zimbabwe, you're talking about Zambia and Botswana and the Kaza region, and there's a lot of politics there. But one of the things that I'm really encouraged by is that if I told you 10 years ago that we would be working in Southern Africa, I think we would be laughed out of the room. And mostly because of our stance on individual animals and intrinsic value and sustainable use. But my strategy was to say, listen, you're going to take some abuse. I have to sit through some really difficult meetings, and people get quite agitated when they're losing, in their view, 60 million, 100 million US dollars. And that's the milieu, if you will, of Zimbabwe, which is now speaking on behalf of IFAW, which is pretty extraordinary. It's pretty extraordinary. Those Southern African countries are members of SADC, which is the Southern African Economic Development Council, and so they're in different political blocs. But I think that there will be other organizations that are very interested, which is, I think, a good thing, but it has to be managed so that I made it really clear in the very beginning that if there's a red line for us, it's trophy hunting and protecting individual animals as part of rescue. And so, I didn't sugarcoat that at all. I just said that is the red line for us. And so we're offering something else. So I think that there are opportunities. Some of the things in Malawi are interesting. One of the chief said he was a little bit concerned about the area right outside of Kasungu National Park because it's very forested, and that from a tourism perspective, tourists want to see the big five. They want to see them quickly, and so the forested areas may be more difficult. So that may require us to shift. But in the end, it gets down to the issue of how much can we afford to do, and that's why it's important to try to get the message out, and that even if there's investment or that we affect investment that doesn't come necessarily to IFAW, but if we could stop a mine or if we could shift a road, that in the end achieves the mission, which is to save lives, end of the day. So yeah, Mira, I think it is elastic, and the bigger it gets, the happier I'll be, but it takes a lot of thinking, and that's where the individual relationships and the travel and the pandemic and the impact that it's had has slowed us down with that, because it is difficult to travel multiple countries.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you for that question, Mira. Thank you to all of our Global Council members and our board members for joining us today. Thank you, Azzedine, for your insights and just truly candid, responses. I think it's wonderful that you're able to recognize and articulate the many challenges that lay ahead. But I think that is what grounds this work and informs the work going forward. And we do have a lot to look forward to in 2022 and beyond. This was naturally, a conversation that was pretty focused on our work in Eastern and Southern Africa. I think that we touched, very briefly on policy, on our work in China, on other global initiatives. And so, I'd like to build on that for future Global Council briefings. But until then, we have run out of time today. So, I look forward to seeing everyone at the next one. And, thank you to all of you from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of IFAW for your continued support and participation. This session was recorded, so Heather will be circulating a link in her follow-up, and any materials. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any additional questions or follow-up comments. Thanks, everyone.